Okay, so part two for today. Well, it won't be part two for those people in the online class when I update. Let's see if this works. Make sure that there we go. It's got audio. That's good. So television and radio. So for over half a century, television was the dominant form of entertainment. Once it was widely available, it became the dominant form of entertainment and advertising for about half a century. Now, this is going to be incredible to most of you, and it was incredible to me when my mother told me this. My mother is 73 years old, and she remembers clearly when they got their first television. I mean, she remembers a time before TV, before her family had a television, and then distinctly when they got a television. I think she said she was like 4 or 5 years old. There was a time when television went off at a certain point. In the early stages, my mother says that when she was growing up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, television came on in the morning, and then during the midsection of the day, it actually went off, and then it came on again at night. Now, that was a very brief period of time. What they started doing was they started developing midday programming, and a lot of that midday programming consisted of what were called soap operas. And almost all of the soap operas are gone now. I think there's one soap opera that's left on a major network. So in the early days of television, and they were called soap operas because they were on during the middle of the day, and they were targeted towards housewives, and they sold soap. I mean, that's why they were called soap operas. So my mother remembers a time when television went off. It came on in the morning, it went off in midday, and came back on in the afternoon and evening. That was very short-lived. Then we get midday programming with soap operas. And so they started advertising and selling products that would be applicable to housewives, like dishwashing detergent, laundry soap, things like that. You all can't imagine a time. And then when I was growing up, and we lived out in the country, and we didn't have satellite at the time, so we got via a television antenna, we got 4, 5, and 9, which is ABC, NBC, CBS, and then the public broadcasting network, which was on a different frequency. So you had these three forms of, or these three channels. And I remember when television did go off at midnight. So at around midnight, it may have been a few minutes before, they would play the Star Spangled Banner on television. They would show a flag waving, and then you would go to the screen, which had these bars of color, and the television would go, and you would flip it off because it was just sort of this annoying noise, and it didn't come back on again until something like 6 a.m. in the morning. So I can remember that time period. You all don't remember that time period at all, I'm sure. None of you remember television going off at midnight. So there were these three major networks traditionally, and that dominated for a long period of time. Once it came into existence, it dominated the advertising industry. And there was a very popular show that came out that highlighted sort of the dominance that this industry played in the advertising era, which was called Mad Men. And they were called Mad Men because all of the advertising agencies, the big advertising agencies, were located on Madison Avenue in New York City. And so this was, if you were a major national company, that's where you wanted to advertise. You got on the networks, and you advertised on television. So television was, this sort of Goliath for many, many years in terms of the advertising and entertainment industry. That, of course, changed once we started using the internet with greater and greater frequency. But television, in spite of the fact that particularly among your age group, because you don't like ads and you can zip through them or you can zap, which is you change stations. Again, when I was a kid growing up, remote controls were a luxury. That was a big deal. You could tell if somebody was sort of affluent if they had a remote control, and you would be absolutely horrified at what remote controls. You would push a button and you could hear like a circuit breaker click, and then it would change. This was fascinating. In the early ages of my childhood, the remote control was called your kid. Your parents would say, Grant, get up and change it to ABC, or change the channel to 3, or 4, 5, or 9, which were the ABC, CBS, and NBC stations. And then we got our first remote control, and it was this huge thing that you held in your hand. It was bigger than this, it was thicker than this, and you push the buttons and you'd hear it click, and it was a miracle. The channel would change on the television, and that was a huge deal to have. That was it was like really, really incredible. So because it took effort to get up and change the channel, people actually watched. They stayed through the ads. Now that you have a remote control and you can zip and zap very quickly through things, that's no longer the case. But the advantages that this allowed, particularly in those early ages when people sort of watched it, was this was much more creative. It allowed for you to basically come up with little stories, sort of vignettes. And so it was enormously creative. People could see how things were used. Before television, you had to rely on radio, and radio, you had to use a mental imagery. And before that, the dominant form of advertising was newspapers or print media. Well, you could describe a lot, but you couldn't actually see people using it. Now, all of a sudden, you can see people using the product. So you had an enormous amount of impact. You could also get a lot of coverage very, very quickly. And an advantage is that in terms of your reach per thousand, your cost per thousand, it's very low. Now, there's a disadvantage, which is also in cost on the other side that small businesses face. But for large businesses particularly, television was a very efficient form of communicating their message to prospective purchasers or clients or constituents. It also had a lot of captivity in that period of time. Now that is again changed because people now can change the channel. And it commanded your attention. Can you imagine what it was like going, my mother remembers, a time before television in her household, how much this impacted. It was like, for my generation, what the internet did for us in terms of what we were able to, get and be entertained, even in the early ages when pages were largely static. So it had a lot of captivity and a lot of attention in that early age. Now, I said cost was an advantage for companies like my mother's company. Because of the production costs alone, that was cost prohibitive. And then the purchasing of airtime can also be very expensive for small to mid-sized businesses. So although cost is very efficient for large businesses, the upfront costs and the amount to produce commercials can be relatively expensive. And so for lots of small businesses, it is cost prohibitive. There is a lack of selectivity. When you put your message out, now you have an idea, again, going back to the early ages of television, of your audience at various times. So for example, historically, when television was released, going back in time, the vast majority of women did not work outside the home. If they did work outside the home, there were sort of only 3 jobs that were really available to them. and this is even indicative of my mother's generation. It's not that there weren't women lawyers in my mother's generation. There were, but they were very rare. My mother wanted to go to law school. She wanted to be a lawyer. I think that's why she ended up with 2 lawyers, because she pushed me to go to law school, because she had wanted to go to law school. But her mother said, you got to get a, you got to get a teaching degree, because you'll have to have something to fall back on. And what happens when choices are limited in situations like that is, if something's not an option, you don't think about it. And so my mother thought, well, because my mother's willing to pay for a teaching degree, I'll get a teaching degree, and then maybe I'll go to law school afterwards. Well, once you get into a profession and you start teaching, and then you get married and you have children, things happen, and it becomes more and more difficult to do that. But in this early age, because there were only 3 professions that were open to women, and the vast majority of women stayed at home, you knew that during the middle of the day, you were not likely to sell business suits to businessmen, because they were going to be at work, and there wasn't going to be a television at work for the most part. And so you had some idea of the demographic that was watching. But then as television became more pervasive and we started having televisions in more and more places, and now it's on constantly, and among my generation and older, the television is just constantly on. It's sort of a background noise. We grew up with it, we're used to it, and it's sort of always on, the same way that you are always on your telephone or your computer or your tablet or whatever. So there was a lack of selectivity. Once you start getting that where it's everybody's watching it, you're getting a lot of wasted coverage, because if you're selling stuff that's not applicable to the target demographic that you're looking at, or target market, you're wasting a lot of coverage, right? The message is fleeting. The typical commercial lasts 30 seconds. And so it's you hear it and then it's gone. It's not like print or something where it lays around and you can look at it for a long period of time. There's lots of clutter. There's multiple ads, in the breaks between segments. You have now limited viewer attention. This wasn't in the early ages, this wasn't true, but now what people do is they zip, they zap, or they get up at a commercial break and go do something else. So you're having to fight for that attention. Or what I do is, as we're watching television in the evening, is the minute a commercial comes on, we tend to be news junkies in my family. My mother was a city councilman before me, and she was vice mayor before I was. We have this tendency to, like, the minute the commercial comes on, so we watch a lot of cable news network. The minute it comes on, I start picking up my phone and doing something else, right? Because I've got a bad case of ADD, and I've got to do something in that time. I'm not actually watching the commercial, so limited viewer attention. Again, if we went back in time, this wasn't true, because this box in front of us was more entertaining than playing with, your non-motorized toys that children had in the 1950s and 60s. There's a lot of distrust, particularly now among your generation. Older generations, you still find, particularly when we talk about the VALS types, among survivors, and there's a lot of survivors in the older population who are on a very fixed income. They don't necessarily have the level of distrust. They view advertising as a legitimate source of information. But among your generation, particularly where you have the ability to start doing this, and you all have done it, we all do it now. We'll be out with our group of friends and somebody will say something and you instantly start Googling to verify whether or not they're correct and whether or not they're actually making any sense, right? Or so that you can make a point in counter. So there's a lot of distrust, and so there's also, that leads to a lot of negative evaluation on the part of viewers. That didn't used to happen. Radio. Prior to television, it was the dominant form of advertising. And prior to radio, the dominant form was newspapers and magazines, right? The printing press for centuries was, allowed businesses to communicate. But once radio was introduced, well, now you've got a big reach in terms of what you can get with people. And prior to television, radio was dominant. Your text tells you that it's now called the Rodney Dangerfield of media. And I don't know why they put that in there, because you all don't know who Rodney Dangerfield is. You've probably never seen a Rodney Dangerfield movie, but he was this comedian, and his punchline was, "I get no respect." And if you saw the guy and if you ever watched him, you would understand why he got no respect. He was just sort of stupid. I mean, it was slapstick comedy. Now your text tells you that radio, doesn't get any respect. It's sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of media. It's primarily, historically, if we went back before television, it was national. You found national ads that were run on radio. Now it's primarily local. And that's because, most of it is limited to a geographic area. And so people listen to the radio, on a local station, and there's lots of local stations that are not necessarily affiliated with, big syndicates, although that's changed. So it was primarily a local medium, as opposed to television. The advantages of radio are cost. It's very cheap now to advertise on the radio. It's efficient. But again, there's a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. There's a difference between, for example, most preferred and preferred by most. That's kind of the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. Just because something's efficient doesn't necessarily mean that it's effective. What you want is you want both efficiency and effectiveness, right? One of the things that makes radio, particularly among my generation and older, is that there's an emotional connection oftentimes to a station. You listen to radio historically when you're going to work or when you're traveling on your way to or from someplace. And most people had a favorite station that they listened to. If you are a country fan in Oklahoma City, in the Oklahoma City market, there are 3 stations. The biggest one and the most popular is probably 101.9, which is the Twister. I think it's still called the Twister. They've changed their name several times. But that was the station that I listened to because I'm a country and Western fan, right? So there's an emotional connection to radio that you didn't necessarily have with television because, people switch. It's not like, 4, 5, or 9, ABC, NBC, CBS, played different programming. They all sort of had the same kinds of shows, sitcoms, soap operas, things like that on historically. So you have selectivity. You're not necessarily exceeding your reach. It would be stupid for my mother's business, for example, to try and advertise on national television because we have lots of people that you're going to reach that you're never going to get to come to the Stone Line Inn, a small bed and breakfast in the middle of the country in the state of Oklahoma. So you can have selectivity in that, we can target the audience in the Oklahoma City area. You have a lot of flexibility. You can change it quickly. It doesn't require long lead times like you have with print media. And one of the things that's an advantage of radio as opposed to television is it requires you to actually think about it. It requires you to come up with an image in your own mind. Now, that can also be a disadvantage in that you may think you're communicating, and again, going back to when we talked about ethics and how difficult it is to know what it is we know, this epistemological problem. What is this? Is this a table or is it a desk? The mental image you may be creating in somebody's mind may not be the mental image that you want. But because radio doesn't give you a visual, it does require some mental exercise on the part of the consumer. And so that can create a deeper connection, a more lasting connection with that consumer than television, which is just in your face. It's right there. It doesn't leave a lot to the imagination. But there is a lack of visual. So one of the disadvantages is that because there is a lack of visual, there is a creative limitation. You're having to rely on the consumer to come up with this mental image in their own mind. Another disadvantage is there's a large number of stations. There's just a fragmentation, which leads to a chaotic buying procedure. There are 10,600 commercial stations in the United States alone. So if you're a national company, not a local company like the Stone Line Inn, and you're wanting to advertise, it can be a daunting prospect to sift through these things. Because most of these stations are small and they don't have the ability to engage in sophisticated consumer research, There are a lack of detailed studies with regard to radio. Once television came in, and if you think about sort of the history of marketing thought and the history of marketing as both a practice and a discipline, marketing during much of the age of radio, as in terms of an academic pursuit, was really in its infancy, and the sophistication of techniques that we could use to measure things was very limited. That's no longer true, but because we now have so much emphasis in marketing research, and because the analytics are so rapidly available on this device or that device or things like that, the focus has really shifted away. So there's a lack of detailed studies in with regard to radio. You have limited listener attention. Historically speaking, when did people listen to the radio? Well, when radio first came out, people had this, it wasn't in your car, it was in a box, sort of like television was, in your home, and people would sit around in the evenings and they would listen to radio. But once we started traveling more, and once the automobile became the dominant form of transportation, and once we got the radio in the car, when are people listening to the radio? When do you listen? If you listen to the radio, most of you probably don't actually listen to radio because you've got your playlist, and your playlist, connects via Bluetooth to your car sound system. It's I don't think we should call it, a car radio anymore, because how many people actually listen to the radio? Do any of you listen to the radio? One person listens to the radio in your car. Most of you don't listen to the radio in your car because you got this, and you listen to your playlist. Or you what? Podcast, or you listen to podcasts. Yeah, absolutely. So that's another one that's taken away from radios, that now we've got our playlist, we've got our podcasts that we're listening to. But historically, again, if you went back in time, radio was this big box that sat in your living room. People sat around and they listened to radio programming, these kinds of, they had soap operas on the radio, and they had other types of entertainment. People would listen to ball games. One of my friends, my best friend, who recently passed away, who was my boss here on campus when I was in the Office of Legal Counsel, he grew up listening to baseball. I can't imagine watching or listening to a baseball game on the radio, but he could, because he grew up listening to it that way. But among my generation and younger, where did we listen to the radio? Well, we listened to it not in our home listening to the baseball game. We listened to it in the car. And you're highly distracted when you're in the car. You got to pay attention to the road. And so you have limited listener attention. There's lots of now competition from digital media and satellite radio. And so you don't necessarily have the coverage that you once had. People don't have their favorite station anymore. They're listening to their podcasts. They're listening to their playlists and things like that. And you also have a lot of clutter. Again, you've got lots of ads in a spot, when they go to commercial, when they take a commercial break between programming, you've got a lot of different advertisers that are in that spot. And so you've got a lot of clutter that you have to get through. And I made it through 2 chapters in one day. Yay, any questions? All right, well, if you got ducks, come see me and I will give you your bonus points for today. And I will end the live stream there.